In the United States, hospitals and nursing homes are places people trust with their lives. Every day, millions of patients rely on nurses and medical staff to care for them when they're at their most vulnerable. For the vast majority of healthcare workers, that trust is honored with dedication, compassion, and long hours spent helping strangers recover. But every once in a while, that trust is broken. Across several decades in American history, investigators have uncovered rare but deeply disturbing cases where medical workers used their positions not to heal, but to harm. These crimes often went unnoticed at first, hidden behind hospital routines, medical paperwork, and the assumption that deaths inside healthcare facilities were simply part of illness or old age. Tonight, we're looking at some of the most disturbing crimes ever committed by healthcare workers in the United States, cases that forced hospitals, investigators, and entire communities to confront a chilling question: what happens when the people trusted to save lives become the ones taking them? Before we begin, let me know down in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I always like seeing how far these stories travel around the world. And if you enjoy carefully researched true crime documentaries like this one, make sure to subscribe. There are many more real cases coming soon. Jeanine Jones, 1981 to 1982, Texas. On March 31, 1982, inside a small pediatric clinic in Kerrville, Texas, a 15-month-old girl named Chelsea Ann McClellan suddenly stopped breathing moments after receiving an injection from a nurse. Staff rushed to save her, but the toddler could not be revived. The nurse who had prepared the syringe was 31-year-old Jeanine Ann Jones. What first appeared to be a tragic medical emergency would soon expose a pattern that investigators had quietly begun noticing across hospitals in the San Antonio area. Jeanine Jones was born on July 13, 1950, in San Antonio, Texas. Her early life was unstable. She spent part of her childhood in foster care before being adopted as a teenager. As an adult, she trained as a licensed vocational nurse and began working in local hospitals in the late 1970s. By the beginning of the 1980s, she had secured a job at Bexar County Hospital, a major public hospital that treated thousands of patients each year. At first, Jones appeared to be a hard-working nurse. But during 1981, coworkers began noticing something that made them uneasy. Infants in the pediatric intensive care unit were experiencing sudden and unexplained medical crises. Babies who had been stable would abruptly stop breathing or suffer cardiac arrest. In several cases, emergency resuscitation was required to keep them alive. The incidents did not immediately trigger a criminal investigation. Hospitals can see unpredictable complications, especially among fragile newborns. Still, the frequency of emergencies raised concerns among some doctors and nurses. When hospital administrators quietly reviewed records, they noticed that many of the unexplained events had occurred during shifts when Jeanine Jones was working. The hospital eventually removed Jones from the pediatric intensive care unit in late 1981. She was later dismissed from the hospital, though no criminal charges were filed at the time. Soon afterward, she found another job about 65 miles away at a pediatric clinic in Kerrville, Texas. Families brought their children there for routine medical visits and minor illnesses. Then came the appointment that would change the course of the investigation. On March 31, 1982, Rosemary McClellan brought her daughter Chelsea to the Kerrville clinic because the child had a fever and symptoms of illness. During the visit, Jones prepared an injection that she said was part of the child's treatment. Within moments of receiving the shot, Chelsea stopped breathing. Staff attempted emergency treatment, but the toddler could not be revived. An autopsy later determined that Chelsea had received a massive dose of succinylcholine, a powerful muscle-paralyzing drug that stops breathing when administered improperly. The medication had not been prescribed for the child. Investigators quickly focused on the nurse who had handled the injection. As they examined the clinic's records, they also learned about another troubling case. Weeks earlier, an infant named Rolando Santos had suddenly collapsed after receiving treatment from Jones. Unlike Chelsea, that child survived after emergency intervention. Authorities soon expanded the investigation back to San Antonio. Doctors and nurses from Bexar County Hospital described the earlier cluster of unexplained medical emergencies that had occurred during Jones's shifts. Some infants had shown signs of exposure to medications they were not supposed to receive, including the blood thinner heparin. While many of those earlier incidents could not be proven as crimes due to missing evidence and incomplete records, the pattern became difficult to ignore. Genene Jones was arrested in 1983. She was charged with the murder of Chelsea McClellan and with injuring Rolando Santos. Her trial began in 1984 in Kerr County, Texas. Medical experts explained how succinylcholine could rapidly paralyze the muscles responsible for breathing. Witnesses described how Jones had prepared the syringe shortly before Chelsea collapsed. After several weeks of testimony, the jury returned its verdict. Genene Jones was convicted of murder in the death of Chelsea McClellan and of injuring Rolando Santos. The court sentenced her to 99 years in prison. As investigators reviewed additional hospital records, they uncovered dozens of unexplained infant deaths and medical emergencies linked to times when Jones had been on duty. Because many of those cases lacked preserved evidence or clear documentation, prosecutors were unable to bring further charges. Some investigators later estimated that as many as 40 to 60 infants may have been affected, though that number has never been proven in court. Experts who studied the case often suggested that Jones's actions may have been driven by what is sometimes called a hero complex. The theory was that she created medical crises so she could step in during the emergency response and appear to save the child. Whether that motive fully explains her actions remains debated. For decades, Jones remained imprisoned in Texas. Then, an unexpected legal development brought the case back into public attention. Due to a mandatory release law tied to prison overcrowding, she was scheduled to become eligible for release in 2018 after serving a portion of her sentence. The possibility that she might leave prison alarmed prosecutors and the families connected to the case. Investigators reopened old hospital files and searched for evidence linked to earlier deaths. Their review eventually focused on another infant who had died in 1981 in San Antonio, a 4-month-old boy named Joshua Sawyer. In 2017, prosecutors formally charged Genene Jones with murder in the death of Joshua Sawyer. Facing the new evidence, she later entered a guilty plea in 2020. The plea resulted in additional life sentences, ensuring she would remain in prison for the rest of her life. Today, Genene Jones remains incarcerated in Texas. The investigation surrounding her actions led hospitals across the United States to adopt stricter monitoring of medication access and to pay closer attention to unusual patterns in patient urgencies. For many families in San Antonio and Kerrville, the case remains one of the most unsettling medical crime investigations in Texas history. What began as a series of unexplained hospital emergencies ultimately revealed a pattern that authorities are still trying to fully understand. Charles Cullen, 1988 to 2003, New Jersey and Pennsylvania. On December 12, 2003, investigators from the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office were waiting quietly nearby as 2 nurses sat together inside a diner in Flemington, New Jersey. One of them was Amy Logren, a nurse who had worked alongside Charles Edmund Cullen at Somerset Medical Center. The other was Cullen himself. What he did not realize was that Logren had agreed to help investigators. During their conversation, Cullen calmly admitted what authorities had been trying to confirm. Patients had been dying because he had been secretly injecting them with lethal doses of hospital medications. Within hours of that meeting, Cullen was taken into custody, ending a 16-year trail of unexplained hospital deaths across 2 states. Charles Cullen was born on February 22, 1960, in West Orange, New Jersey. His childhood was difficult. His father died when Cullen was very young, and his family struggled financially and emotionally afterward. During his teenage years, he experienced serious mental health difficulties and multiple suicide attempts, something later documented in medical and military records. In 1978, he joined the United States Navy, where he trained as a medical corpsman while serving aboard a submarine. After leaving the Navy in 1984, he pursued nursing as a civilian career and graduated from the Mountainside Hospital School of Nursing in Montclair, New Jersey in 1987. In 1988, Cullen began working as a registered nurse at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey. The hospital placed him in a burn unit where patients often required heavy medication. During his time there, at least one patient died after receiving an unexplained overdose of medication. The incident raised internal concerns, but no criminal charges were filed. Cullen left the hospital in 1992. Over the next decade, he moved through a long series of medical jobs across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Among the facilities where he worked were Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg, Hunterdon Medical Center in Raritan Township, Morristown Memorial Hospital in Morristown, and Easton Hospital in Easton, Pennsylvania. In several cases, he either resigned or was dismissed after hospital staff raised concerns about medication handling or patient safety. Yet despite repeated warnings, Cullen kept finding new employment. His nursing license was never permanently revoked during those years. Hospitals often handled internal concerns quietly, and information about problematic staff members was rarely shared between institutions. As Cullen continued working, a disturbing pattern followed him. Patients who had been stable would suddenly go into cardiac arrest or suffer dramatic drops in blood sugar. Later investigations revealed that Cullen frequently used powerful medications such as insulin, digoxin, lidocaine, and magnesium chloride. Digoxin, a heart medication, became particularly associated with his crimes because large doses can stop the heart. For years, the deaths appeared scattered across different hospitals, which made the pattern difficult to detect. The investigation that finally exposed Cullen began in 2003 at Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey. Cullen had been hired there as a night shift nurse in the intensive care unit. During the summer of that year, several patients experienced unexpected medical crises. One of them was 78-year-old Reverend Florian Gall, who died suddenly after suffering cardiac complications. Hospital administrators began reviewing medication records and noticed unusual activity connected to automated drug dispensing systems known as Pyxis machines. These computerized cabinets track when nurses withdraw medications for patients. Hence, investigators discovered that Cullen had found a way to bypass parts of the tracking system. He would place an order for a medication and then quickly cancel the request. The drawer would still open, allowing him to remove drugs without the system logging them as officially dispensed. This loophole helped him avoid detection for years. After hospital officials reported their concerns, the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office launched a formal investigation with help from the New Jersey State Police. Detectives reviewed hospital data, interviewed staff members, and discovered multiple suspicious medication withdrawals tied to Cullen's work shifts. One of the key figures in the investigation became Amy Loughran. She had worked closely with Cullen and had developed a personal friendship with him. When investigators approached her, she agreed to help by continuing conversations with him while detectives monitored the situation. That cooperation led to the meeting on December 12, 2003, in Flemington. During their conversation, Cullen acknowledged harming patients. Shortly afterward, investigators moved in and arrested him. The case quickly expanded as detectives began reviewing deaths at other hospitals where he had worked. In the months that followed, Cullen confessed to investigators that he had intentionally killed patients by injecting lethal drug doses into intravenous lines or saline bags. His admissions linked him to crimes across multiple hospitals over 16 years. In March 2006, Cullen pleaded guilty in New Jersey to murdering 13 patients and attempting to murder 2 others. Later that same year, he also pleaded guilty in Pennsylvania to several additional murders connected to hospitals in that state. Altogether, Cullen confessed to killing 29 patients between 1988 and 2003. Investigators were able to link him to at least 40 suspicious deaths based on hospital records and medical reviews. Some researchers and biographers who studied the case believe the true number could be far higher. A few estimates have suggested the victim count might approach 400, although that figure has never been proven in court. Between 2006 and 2007, courts in New Jersey and Pennsylvania sentenced Charles Cullen to multiple life terms. In New Jersey alone, he received 11 consecutive life sentences. Additional convictions in Pennsylvania increased the total to 18 consecutive life sentences. Today, Charles Cullen remains incarcerated in the New Jersey State Prison System and will never be eligible for release. The case forced hospitals across the United States to review how medications are tracked and how unusual patterns of patient deaths are reported. For many families, the revelations were deeply unsettling. Some learned years later that relatives they believed had died from natural illness had actually been victims of one of the most prolific hospital killers in American history. Orville Lynn Majors, 1993-1995, Indiana. On October 22, 1997, investigators in Vermilion County, Indiana, arrested a nurse named Orville Lynn Majors. For years, doctors and nurses at Vermilion County Hospital in the small city of Clinton had struggled to understand a troubling pattern. Patients who appeared stable would suddenly go into cardiac arrest during the night shift. Many of those emergencies happened while Majors was working. By the time authorities finally intervened, the small rural hospital had recorded an unusually high number of unexplained deaths, and staff members had begun to suspect that something far more serious than natural illness was happening. Orville Lynn Majors was born on April 24, 1961, in Linton, Indiana. After training as a licensed practical nurse, he began working in hospitals in the late 1980s. In 1992, he was hired by Vermilion County Hospital in Clinton, Indiana. The hospital served a relatively small community, and the staff was tight-knit. Nurses and doctors often worked the same shifts together for years, and it didn't take long for employees to notice patterns in patient care. Majors typically worked the night shift, caring for patients who were often elderly or recovering from serious illnesses. During his first months at the hospital, nothing appeared unusual. But by 1993, some staff members began noticing something unsettling. Patients seemed to go into cardiac arrest more frequently when Majors was on duty. At first, these events were not treated as suspicious. Many patients at the hospital were older and had complicated medical conditions. Sudden health declines could happen, but over time, the number of emergency codes during Majors' shifts began to stand out. Two nurses in particular, Teresa Hodge and Helen McVeigh, grew increasingly concerned. They started informally comparing notes about the incidents happening during the night shift. What they discovered disturbed them. A large number of patients who had suffered sudden cardiac arrest had been under Majors' care shortly before the emergency. As their concerns grew, the nurses began documenting the incidents they observed. Their notes showed a clear pattern. When Majors worked the night shift, the number of cardiac emergencies rose dramatically. Other hospital staff noticed unusual behavior as well. Some co-workers later testified that Majors was frequently seen carrying a syringe in his pocket while moving through the hospital wards. In other situations, families of patients recalled being told by Majors to step away briefly, sometimes suggesting they go get a cup of coffee or take a short break. Shortly afterward, the patient would suddenly suffer a cardiac arrest. Those patterns deeply unsettled several members of the nursing staff. Another detail that later surfaced during testimony involved Majors' attitude toward certain patients. Witnesses described him as becoming frustrated with elderly patients who required frequent attention. Some co-workers recalled him complaining about call bells or describing patients as demanding or difficult to care for. While those comments alone did not prove a crime, they added context to the growing concerns among staff members. By 1994 and 1995, the number of cardiac arrest calls during Majors' shifts had become difficult for hospital administrators to ignore. Officials at Vermilion County Hospital began reviewing patient charts and staffing records. The review revealed that a striking percentage of the unexplained cardiac arrests had occurred while Majors was working. Eventually, the hospital reported the concerns to the Indiana State Department of Health. A formal investigation began involving medical experts and law enforcement authorities. Doctors reviewing the cases focused on the possibility that potassium chloride might have been used. Potassium is sometimes administered in hospitals to treat certain conditions, but in high doses, it can disrupt the heart's electrical rhythm and cause fatal arrhythmias. One of the challenges investigators faced was that potassium leaves little trace after death. In many of the suspected cases, autopsies had not been performed, as the deaths were initially believed to be natural. Even without direct chemical proof in every case, investigators continued building the timeline by examining medical records, hospital schedules, and witness statements from staff members. In October 1997, authorities decided they had gathered enough evidence to act. On October 22, 1997, Orville Lynn Majors was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder connected to deaths at Vermilion County Hospital. The case drew intense public attention in the region, particularly because the hospital served such a small community. Due to widespread publicity, the trial was moved from Vermilion County to Indianapolis. The trial began in early 1999. Jurors heard testimony from nurses, doctors, statisticians, and investigators who had analyzed the unusual pattern of cardiac arrests at the hospital. Witnesses described how the number of emergency codes during Majors' shifts far exceeded what would normally be expected in a hospital of that size. Several staff members also testified about the syringe they had seen him carrying and about the unusual moments when patients suddenly collapsed after he had been alone with them. Medical experts explained how potassium chloride could cause the sudden heart rhythm disturbances that had been observed in several patients. The defense argued that the patients were elderly and seriously ill, suggesting that the deaths could have resulted from natural medical complications. After weeks of testimony, the jury began deliberating. In April 1999, Orville Lynn Majors was found guilty of 6 counts of murder involving patients who had died while under his care. Investigators had examined many more deaths, but those 6 cases represented the incidents where the evidence was strongest. The judge sentenced Majors to 60 years in prison for each count of murder. The sentences were ordered to run consecutively, totaling 360 years. Today, Orville Lynn Majors remains incarcerated in the Indiana Department of Correction. The investigation into the deaths at Vermilion County Hospital remains one of the most widely discussed medical crime cases in Indiana, centered on a pattern that hospital staff had struggled to explain until the evidence finally brought the truth into the open. Kimberly Saenz, 2008, Texas. On April 30, 2008, investigators in Lufkin, Texas, arrested a nurse named Kimberly Clark Saenz after a series of unexplained medical emergencies at a local dialysis clinic. For several weeks, patients at the DaVita Dialysis Center had suddenly collapsed during routine treatments. Some had died soon after being rushed to nearby hospitals. When authorities began piecing together what had happened inside the clinic, they discovered that several witnesses had seen something deeply disturbing: a nurse preparing a cup of bleach and injecting it into dialysis lines connected to patients. Kimberly Clark Saenz was a licensed vocational nurse working at the DaVita Dialysis Clinic in Lufkin, a city in Angelina County in East Texas. The clinic treated patients with kidney failure who depended on dialysis machines to filter toxins from their blood. Most patients visited the clinic several times a week, often sitting for hours while the machines performed the work their kidneys could no longer do. By early 2008, Saenz had been working there as part of the nursing staff responsible for monitoring treatments and assisting patients during dialysis sessions. At first, nothing about the clinic's daily routine seemed unusual, but in the spring of that year, a troubling pattern began to appear. On April 1, 2008, multiple dialysis patients suddenly became critically ill during their treatments. One of them was 72-year-old Billy Ray Boykin. After suffering a severe medical crisis during dialysis, Boykin was transported to a hospital where he later died. His death raised concern among doctors because dialysis procedures rarely produce sudden reactions of that severity. Within days, additional patients from the same clinic began arriving at hospitals with similar symptoms. Several had collapsed during dialysis treatments. Others developed sudden complications shortly after leaving the clinic. Doctors and hospital staff quickly realized that something unusual was happening. Health officials began examining dialysis equipment and treatment records. When investigators reviewed schedules from the clinic, they noticed that several of the patients who had fallen ill had received treatment during shifts when Kimberly Sayans was working. But what truly changed the direction of the investigation were the accounts from two dialysis patients who had been present during treatments. Linda Hall and Lurleen Hamilton both told investigators they had seen Sayans handling bleach shortly before some of the medical emergencies occurred. According to their statements, Sayans measured bleach into a cup and used a syringe to introduce the liquid into dialysis lines connected to patients receiving treatment. Bleach contains sodium hypochlorite, a chemical that is extremely dangerous when introduced into the bloodstream. Those eyewitness accounts prompted investigators to search Sayans's home and review her computer activity. During that search, authorities found internet queries that added another disturbing element to the case. Records showed that Sayans had searched online for phrases including, "How much bleach does it take to kill someone?" and bleach poisoning. Combined with the witness statements and the medical evidence, the discovery strengthened the case against her. Laboratory testing on dialysis equipment and patient samples also confirmed exposure to sodium hypochlorite. Medical experts later explained that when bleach enters the bloodstream, it can cause severe internal damage and organ failure, especially in patients already weakened by kidney disease. As investigators continued their review, they identified multiple victims connected to the events at the clinic. 5 dialysis patients died following the incidents in April 2008. The victims were Billy Ray Boykin, Thelma Bell Metcalf, Veronica Harrison, Cora Sue Galbraith, and Clara Strange. Several other patients survived after experiencing severe complications during their treatments. Witness testimony also suggested that Sayans appeared visibly upset and frustrated during some of the dialysis sessions when patients became ill. Some co-workers later described her as being in a bad mood or acting angry at work during that period. While the exact motive was debated during the investigation, testimony indicated that the actions may have been connected to dissatisfaction with the workplace rather than a desire for attention or recognition. On April 30, 2008, Kimberly Sayans was formally arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder and aggravated assault. The case took several years to move through the court system as prosecutors gathered medical evidence and prepared expert testimony explaining how the poisonings had occurred. Her trial began in January 2012 in Angelina County, Texas. Jurors heard testimony from dialysis patients, medical specialists, clinic employees, and investigators who had worked on the case. The statements from Linda Hall and Lurleen Hamilton became a central part of the trial because they described directly witnessing Sayans preparing bleach and injecting it into dialysis lines. Medical experts also explained how sodium hypochlorite entering a dialysis line could quickly spread through a patient's bloodstream and cause severe internal reactions. After hearing the evidence, the jury deliberated before delivering its verdict. On January 27, 2012, Kimberly Clark Sayans was convicted of capital murder for the death of Billy Ray Boykin. The jury also found her guilty of 4 additional murder counts and 5 counts of aggravated assault related to other dialysis patients who had survived the attacks. Under Texas law, the capital murder conviction carried the possibility of the death penalty. Prosecutors ultimately pursued a sentence of life imprisonment without parole. The court sentenced Sayans to life in prison. The case deeply affected the Lufkin community, where many residents had relied on the dialysis clinic for life-saving treatments. Families of the victims said the crimes shattered their trust in a medical environment where patients should have felt safe. Today, Kimberly Clark Sayans remains incarcerated in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole for the deaths of 5 dialysis patients in April 2008. Efren Saldivar, 1988-1998, California. On March 31, 1998, detectives from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department sat across from a hospital employee inside an interview room in Glendale, California. The man was Efren Saldivar, a respiratory therapist who had spent years working at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. During questioning that afternoon, Saldivar made a statement that immediately stunned investigators. He admitted that he had deliberately caused the deaths of numerous patients under his care. According to his own account, he had injected critically ill patients with drugs that would stop their breathing. What began as a routine hospital inquiry quickly became one of the most disturbing medical crime investigations in California. Efren Saldivar was born on June 28, 1969 in California. Unlike many medical killers who worked as nurses, Saldivar was a respiratory therapist. Respiratory therapists play a specialized role in hospitals, particularly in intensive care units. They operate ventilators, assist patients who cannot breathe on their own, and often work with patients who are intubated or dependent on breathing machines. Because of that role, respiratory therapists frequently move between rooms and interact with critically ill patients without drawing attention in a busy hospital environment. Saldivar began working at Glendale Adventist Medical Center in 1988. The hospital served thousands of patients in Los Angeles County and treated many elderly or seriously ill individuals. Respiratory therapists like Saldivar were responsible for monitoring breathing equipment and assisting with life support treatments. For years, nothing about his work appeared unusual. The patients he treated were often already very sick, and deaths were not uncommon in intensive care units. Because of that, a pattern of suspicious deaths would be extremely difficult to detect. The investigation that eventually exposed Saldivar began in early 1998. Hospital administrators noticed irregularities involving controlled medications kept in the hospital pharmacy. Some drugs appeared to be missing in quantities that did not match documented patient treatments. The medications included powerful muscle-paralyzing drugs such as pancuronium bromide, a medication sometimes used in hospitals during specific medical procedures. Pancuronium bromide works by paralyzing the muscles that control breathing. If administered improperly without respiratory support, the drug can stop a patient from breathing. When hospital officials reviewed medication records, they discovered that Efren Saldivar had signed out some of the missing drugs. Because those medications were not clearly connected to authorized treatments, administrators reported the issue to law enforcement. Detectives from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department interviewed Saldivar on March 31, 1998. During that interview, he admitted injecting critically ill patients with muscle relaxants such as pancuronium bromide. In his initial statement, he told investigators he had done this dozens of times over several years. Saldivar claimed that he had been carrying out what he described as mercy killings, targeting patients he believed were suffering or unlikely to recover. But during questioning, he also described something more disturbing. According to investigators, he admitted that he sometimes decided whether a patient should live or die based on his own personal feelings about them. In that context, he reportedly described the syringe he used as his magic tool. Despite the confession, the investigation soon faced a major obstacle. Most of the patients Saldivar described had been seriously ill when they died, and many had not undergone autopsies. Without physical evidence confirming the presence of the drugs, prosecutors had difficulty proving individual murders. Shortly after his confession, Saldivar withdrew many of his earlier statements and claimed he had exaggerated his involvement. Because investigators could not immediately link his confession to specific confirmed deaths, he was released while authorities continued the investigation. Over the next several years, detectives and medical examiners worked to re-examine cases involving patients who had died at Glendale Adventist Medical Center while Saldivar was on duty. The effort required an unusual and difficult step. Investigators began exhuming bodies of former patients whose deaths might have matched the pattern described in the confession. In total, more than 20 bodies were exhumed and examined as part of the investigation. Through medical analysis and witness testimony, prosecutors were eventually able to identify several cases where evidence supported criminal charges. Those victims included Jose Alfaro, Salua Nora, Bobby Castillo, Lucrecia Ferrando, Eleanor Chase, and Dorothy Hernant. Each of them had been patients at Glendale Adventist Medical Center when they died. In 2002, after years of investigation, Efren Saldivar agreed to plead guilty in Los Angeles County Superior Court to 6 counts of murder connected to those deaths. The plea ended a case that had taken years to build because of the difficulty of proving the crimes medically. The judge sentenced Saldivar to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even after the convictions, investigators acknowledged that the full extent of his actions might never be known. Saldivar's original confession suggested a far larger number of victims, but many of the suspected deaths lacked the physical evidence required to confirm them in court. The case forced hospitals across the country to reconsider how medications and life support equipment are monitored, particularly in intensive care units where staff members often work independently with critically ill patients. For many families connected to the hospital, the revelations were deeply unsettling. Some relatives of former patients were left wondering whether their loved ones might have been among the unidentified victims. Today, Ren Saldivar remains incarcerated in the California prison system, serving life without parole for the murders of 6 hospital patients. His case remains one of the most unusual medical crime investigations in California, involving a respiratory therapist who had access to some of the most vulnerable patients in the hospital. Kathy Wood, Gwen Graham, 1987 to 1988, Michigan. On December 18, 1988, detectives in Grand Rapids, Michigan, arrested a nursing home employee named Gwen Graham after a confession from her former coworker exposed a disturbing series of deaths at a local care facility. The information came from Kathy Marie Wood, another nurse's aide who had worked alongside Graham at Alpine Manor, a nursing home that housed elderly residents in the western Michigan city. During interviews with investigators, Wood revealed that several residents who had died at the facility had not passed away from natural causes as originally believed. Instead, she said, they had been deliberately smothered while alone in their rooms. The allegations immediately triggered a homicide investigation that focused on 2 employees who had once worked the same shifts, caring for some of the nursing home's most vulnerable residents. Gwen Graham was born on November 6, 1963 in Michigan. Kathy Wood was born in 1962 and also grew up in the region. In 1987, both women were employed as nurses' aides at Alpine Manor, a long-term care facility in Grand Rapids. Their job involved assisting elderly residents with daily tasks such as bathing, feeding, and monitoring their basic health needs. Nursing homes frequently care for residents with serious medical problems, and deaths are not uncommon in those environments. Because of that reality, unusual patterns can sometimes remain unnoticed for long periods. Graham and Wood began working together during shifts at Alpine Manor in 1987. Co-workers later described the 2 women as forming a close friendship that eventually developed into a romantic relationship. According to Wood's later testimony, the relationship took a disturbing turn. She told investigators that Graham began killing residents as a way of strengthening their bond and proving loyalty within the relationship. Wood later explained that Graham believed the shared secret would tie them together permanently. During the investigation, Wood described how the killings took place. The victims were typically elderly residents who were alone in their rooms. Graham would smother them using a washcloth or pillow, cutting off their ability to breathe. Because the residents were elderly and often frail, their deaths were initially recorded as natural causes. Wood later admitted that she sometimes helped identify potential victims and occasionally acted as a lookout while Graham carried out the attacks. In some cases, she also participated directly. Another disturbing detail surfaced during the investigation. According to Wood's testimony, Graham occasionally took small personal items from victims after the killings. These objects were kept as souvenirs and later shown to Wood as proof that the act had been carried out. Wood also described a disturbing idea that had developed between the 2 women. She told investigators that they had discussed choosing victims whose initials could eventually spell the word murder. Investigators later confirmed that although the word was never fully completed, the intent behind the idea was discussed between them. The crimes continued through 1987 and into 1988 without drawing suspicion from authorities. The turning point came when the relationship between Graham and Wood began to fall apart. In 1988, Kathy Wood left Michigan and moved to Texas. After relocating, she entered a new relationship and began speaking about the events that had occurred at Alpine Manor. During conversations with her new partner, Wood revealed details about the killings at the nursing home. Those statements eventually reached law enforcement authorities. Texas investigators contacted police in Michigan, prompting a full investigation into the deaths at Alpine Manor. Detectives traveled to Texas to interview Wood, who provided a detailed statement describing the killings and identifying Graham as the person who had carried them out. Michigan investigators then reviewed nursing home records and began examining the deaths that had occurred during the time the two women worked together. Because the victims had already been buried, authorities ordered several exhumations in an attempt to gather evidence. However, proving smothering is extremely difficult, especially when victims are elderly and have already been buried for months or years. As a result, much of the case relied heavily on Wood's testimony and on statements from individuals who said Graham had spoken about the killings. On December 18, 1988, Gwen Graham was arrested in Michigan and charged with multiple counts of murder connected to the deaths at Alpine Manor. Kathy Wood was also charged, but eventually reached a plea agreement with prosecutors. In exchange for testifying against Graham, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Gwen Graham's trial took place in Kent County, Michigan in 1989. During the proceedings, jurors heard Wood describe the pattern of killings inside the nursing home and explain the disturbing motivations behind them. The defense challenged Wood's credibility, arguing that her testimony was unreliable because she had received a plea agreement. Despite those arguments, the jury ultimately found Graham guilty. In 1989, Gwen Graham was convicted of 5 counts of murder connected to the deaths of elderly residents at Alpine Manor. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kathy Wood received a sentence of 20 to 40 years in prison as part of her plea agreement. After serving nearly 3 decades behind bars, Wood was released from prison on January 16, 2020. She later moved to South Carolina. The case attracted national attention because it revealed that multiple murders had taken place inside a nursing home where families expected their relatives to be safe. For many people in Grand Rapids, the crimes remain one of the most disturbing elder care cases in the region's history. Today, Gwen Graham remains incarcerated in Michigan, serving a life sentence for the murders committed at Alpine Manor. Donald Harvey, 1970–1987. Ohio and Kentucky. On March 12, 1987, police officers in Cincinnati, Ohio, arrested a quiet hospital employee named Donald Harvey after a hospital investigation uncovered disturbing evidence involving a patient's death. The arrest took place after months of suspicion at the Daniel Drake Memorial Hospital, where several deaths had raised questions among medical staff. During questioning, Harvey admitted something investigators had not expected to hear. Over the next several hours, he calmly described a pattern of poisoning patients that stretched back many years. By the end of the interrogation, authorities were confronting one of the most prolific hospital killers in American history. Donald Harvey was born on April 15, 1952, in Butler County, Kentucky. He grew up in a rural area near the Ohio border and had a troubled childhood marked by health problems and family instability. As a young man, he eventually moved to Ohio and found work in hospitals, beginning in the early 1970s. In 1970, Harvey started working at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. He was not a nurse but worked as a nurse's aide and orderly. The position gave him daily access to patients, medications, and hospital food service areas. His duties included helping patients with meals, transporting them within the hospital, and assisting nurses with routine tasks. Not long after beginning the job, Harvey later admitted that he began poisoning patients. According to his later confessions, he initially used cyanide taken from hospital supplies to contaminate food and drinks given to patients. He later claimed that he targeted individuals he believed were already suffering or close to death. At the time, the deaths were attributed to natural causes, and no investigation was launched. Harvey left Marymount Hospital after a short period and moved to Ohio, where he continued working in healthcare facilities. Over the next several years, he held jobs at several hospitals and nursing homes in the Cincinnati area. During this time, he continued poisoning patients using a variety of substances. Investigators later determined that he had used arsenic, cyanide, rat poison, and other toxic chemicals. In some cases, he contaminated food, while in others, he added poison to beverages or intravenous lines. Because many of the victims were elderly or already seriously ill, the deaths rarely raised immediate suspicion. In 1975, Harvey began working at the Cincinnati Veterans Administration Medical Center. Over the next several years, he was employed in positions that allowed him access to patients who required ongoing medical care. During that period, a number of unexplained deaths occurred among patients he had been treating. However, at the time, there was no clear evidence linking those deaths together. Harvey eventually left the VA hospital and later found work at the Daniel Drake Memorial Hospital in Cincinnati, a long-term care facility that treated patients with chronic illnesses. The investigation that finally exposed him began in early 1987. At Daniel Drake Memorial Hospital, several staff members noticed unusual circumstances surrounding the death of a patient named John Powell. Powell had been recovering from surgery and was expected to survive. However, he suddenly died after experiencing severe complications. Hospital administrators ordered a toxicology examination because the symptoms did not match the expected medical course. The results revealed that Powell had been poisoned with cyanide. That discovery immediately triggered a criminal investigation. Detectives began examining who had access to the patient and the hospital supplies where cyanide could have been obtained. Their attention quickly turned to Donald Harvey. When investigators questioned him on March 12, 1987, Harvey admitted that he had poisoned Powell, but the confession did not stop there. During further questioning, he began describing other deaths he said he had caused during his years working in hospitals. Over time, Harvey confessed to killing 37 patients between 1970 and 1987. He described poisoning them using arsenic, cyanide, and other toxic substances. Investigators later discovered that he sometimes poisoned patients who annoyed him or who he believed were suffering. In other cases, he claimed the acts were motivated by anger or frustration. Because many of the deaths had occurred years earlier and victims had been buried without autopsies, authorities faced major difficulties verifying every confession. Even so, prosecutors moved forward with charges involving several confirmed cases. In August 1987, Harvey pleaded guilty in Hamilton County, Ohio, to multiple counts of murder connected to deaths at the Cincinnati hospital. The court sentenced him to several life terms in prison. Later that year, he also pleaded guilty in Kentucky to additional murders connected to his earlier employment at Marymount Hospital. In total, Harvey received multiple life sentences for the confirmed killings. The case quickly attracted national attention because of the sheer number of victims he claimed to have poisoned. Newspapers began referring to him as the Angel of Death, a nickname often used for hospital employees who murder patients in their care. Some investigators believed the true number of victims could be even higher than the 37 he admitted to. However, without physical evidence in older cases, those suspicions could not be confirmed in court. Donald Harvey spent decades in prison following his convictions. On March 28, 2017, while incarcerated at the Toledo Correctional Institution in Ohio, Harvey was attacked by another inmate named James Elliott. The assault left him critically injured. He died 2 days later, on March 30, 2017, at a hospital in Toledo, Ohio. By the time of his death, Donald Harvey had spent nearly 30 years in prison for the murders he committed while working in healthcare facilities. His case remains one of the most widely known hospital poisoning cases in the United States, involving a hospital employee who used his position of trust to carry out a long series of killings that went undetected for many years. Cases like these are rare, but they leave a lasting impact on how people think about trust in healthcare. For most patients and families, nurses represent compassion, protection, and the people who stay beside a hospital bed long after doctors have left the room. The overwhelming majority of nurses live up to that responsibility every single day. But the few who abuse that trust remind us how devastating the consequences can be when power over vulnerable people falls into the wrong hands. Many of the cases we covered tonight took years to uncover. In some situations, the truth only came out because coworkers noticed small patterns, families asked difficult questions, or investigators refused to ignore something that didn't feel right. Those moments of attention and accountability are often the only reason these stories ever come to light. If this video made you think about any of these cases differently, or if one of them stood out to you more than the others, let me know down in the comments. Which case shocked you the most, and why? I always read through the discussion, and it's interesting to see which stories affect people in different ways. And if you enjoy long-form, carefully researched true crime documentaries like this one, make sure to subscribe. There are many more real cases and investigations coming soon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.